I am now at Children at War, this fourth section of this last lecture on Vonnegut. Uh, while we make a great show of caring for our children, we seem to be quite prepared to send them to war. And this is, for me, one of the massive approved contradictions that Galbraith would call it, as Galbraith would call it, or pieces of cognitive dissonance, if you will, that we, do everything we can to protect the children, and then at age 17 or 18, we're like, off to war, that's good, good, good. Unless, of course, you're in the upper middle class or middle class and you have access enough to the law and you can get your children out of going to war, in which case you do. And this is increasingly what has happened, where increasingly the wars that were fought, say, in Afghanistan and Iraq, were fought by the poor in both Canada, America, and Britain, and a number of other countries. It's patented children, specifically 17 to 19-year-old boys raised in this particular culture, make good soldiers because they seem to operate in some ways virtually free of morals. This is certainly what we saw in Platoon, where they have very little imagination that the deaths can happen to them. He's like, nah. And if you've ever seen a 17-year-old boy get a license to drive, you're like, well, we'll see if they survive, the first month of driving. Because there's a sense of untouchability about a teen. Drinking and smoking aren't going to hurt them because they're them. I mean, why would the world have it in for them? I mean, that kind of thing. And Vonnegut's strongest critic is a mother, right? So if you look at page 14, you'll see that, in one of these many sort of narratives within narratives, we have Mary O'Hare, who says, well, I know, she said, you'll pretend you are men instead of babies, and you'll be played in the movies by Frank Sinatra or John Wayne or some of those other glamorous, war-loving, dirty old men. And war will look just wonderful, and so we'll have a lot more of them, and they'll be fought by babies, like the babies upstairs. And then, of course, Vonnegut realizes she's afraid, and she's angry with them because she's afraid that he's gonna make the war look good. And so the one thing that this book does not do is make the war look good, and he promises her, this will not happen. And he says, we had been foolish virgins in the war right at the end of childhood, on page 14. So you can see the difference between a book like this, let's say, and Platoon even. And this is why I wanted you to have this difference, that Platoon, even though it appears to be, sort of, it has Elias and there's these sort of sane characters in it and so on, actually, it really has a hero narrative just as much as Top Gun is. Maybe it's even worse because it passes itself off as being more politically aware. And so we see why Vonnegut has come to call his book The Children's Crusade. Because, which I've talked about before, the average age of the combat soldier in World War II is 26, the average age, which means that there are 40-year-old combat people running around in combat. That number dropped in Vietnam, in the Vietnam War, that number dropped to 19, which means that there are people who are 17 in the field, more than a few of them, because they had to drop that average, right? They were children. And on page 106, we've had to imagine the war here. This is one of the Brits, and we've imagined it was being fought by aging men like ourselves. We've forgotten that wars were fought by babies. When I saw those freshly shaved faces, it was a shock. My God, I said to myself, it's the Children's Crusade, on 106. And Billy is a child among children. He's innocent, he's unaware, he's lost, he's an orphan. And this should then make the connection to page 145, when the Brits, when he arrives at the prisoner of war camp, dress him up and make him into their Cinderella, right? The young, naive, innocent girl. The boots fit perfectly. Billy Pilgrim was Cinderella, and Cinderella was Billy Pilgrim on 145. So here's the the young ingenue whose wishes are going to be granted by the good fairy, and who has been given these boots that are painted and shiny, and he sort of is living in this fabular world of children. Okay, so just keep this stuff in mind because it's gonna come to pay off in the next section.